chemicals that the German chemical industry, which was the best in the world, had come up with without worrying about having to pay for the patents. And so you have this time in the war that scientists and governments are using what we think of as positive things, scientific discovery, to cheat and to kill. And that makes people stop and question. So just like after World War I, people created treaties, so too after World War II, people started to ask, what is this relationship between science and government and the military? And as much as we like to think of technology as something that advances and helps make society better, I think wars show that it's not always positive, that it can have really negative effects too.
My next question was, how did the soldiers on the front line handle the use of chemical warfare?
Yeah, so what did you guys learn about that? I'm interested what you've learned.
That they couldn't really survive most of it because the gas masks were super uncomfortable and they didn't work very well.
Yeah, and can you imagine if you just try to put yourself in their boots? Imagine how terrifying it would be first of all, the chlorine gas, you could see it, right?
Mm-hmm.
But some of the later gases you can't even see very well. And to know that just the air that you breathe can kill you, it must have been so horrible and terrifying. I was watching a video about some historians and archaeologists who were excavating a trench from World War I. And when the historian put on one of those gas masks and talked about how hard it was just to breathe with those on and how you would often vomit into your own mask, I just thought about how miserable that would be. And he said that some soldiers literally tore out their own esophagus trying to take their mask off because they just couldn't breathe, and they in effect made things so much worse. They killed themselves just trying to breathe. So it really would have been horrific, absolutely horrid way to go. I think anything on that trench would have been horrible, but it sounds like the gases were probably the worst. With a bullet or a shell, you can still kind of comprehend what's happening to you.
Mm-hmm.
But this just, oh my goodness, would have been awful.
Was chemical warfare a primary reason trench warfare went away?
That's a really good question. I think that the reason that trench warfare went away was that armies started to understand how to use shock troops and how to use tanks and other mobile forms of fighting, so that battles rarely had time to settle down into trench warfare. So I think that the answer to that is probably no. I don't think that it's one of the major reasons that trench warfare went away. I think trench warfare went away more because of more mobile fighting techniques, ways of using faster moving, as I say, tanks and other armored vehicles and shock troops that sort of do concentrated attacks in small areas and then disrupt the line. I think that, and I'm not a military historian, I'm not a specialist in tactics or strategy and military history, but as best as I understand, as more of a cultural historian, I still do think that it's probably not chemical warfare that causes that change.
Do you think that chemical warfare might be used in future wars, or will it just have happened then and be done?
It's horrible to say yes, but I think when you study history, you realize that human beings, when they're at war, are capable of doing pretty horrible things. And so I think I would feel safer, not in a physical sense, but in making a bet, saying that yes, chemical warfare could be used again. I don't think it would be used on the scale that it was used in World War I, but I think that human beings are capable of doing some pretty horrible things. And so you think about in Syria lately how the Syrian government has used chemical warfare against its own citizens, which is just so horrible and revolting. Or you think about how the Russian secret services have used chemical agents to poison former agents or enemies. It hasn't gone away. I don't think that it's an active, regular battle plan. But I think if you were to talk to some soldiers at Fort Riley and talk to them about their training, they probably all had to undergo some sort of training for chemical warfare, where they have to go into a room and practice putting on a mask and try to be prepared for it. Let's hope that it's like nuclear weapons, in that it's just so horrible we really don't want to use it, but we still have it. But I don't know. I think that the study of history shows that people are still willing to try pretty nasty methods to try and gain an advantage. And it's a depressing lesson to learn.
Do you think that Agent Orange, is outlawed by the treaties? Should be outlawed by the treaties?
I'll be honest, I don't know enough about Agent Orange. I teach a class on World War I. I mean, obviously, I know that it was used in Vietnam and that it definitely is a form of chemical warfare, but I don't know enough about the laws about it. What have you guys figured out about Agent Orange?
It wasn't meant to hurt any humans, but it ended up making genetic mutations for when they had children.
That's so awful, isn't it? Yeah, and I think that the lesson that you learn as a historian studying this kind of question is just that wars bring out the worst in us, and a lot of times people who have the power to make decisions can make pretty awful decisions, really cruel decisions, as they try to gain an advantage. And sadly, I think that happens far too often. And so, yes, Agent Orange is one of those rather shameful choices that our country's own military used in relatively recent history.
What is the most important thing to know about the introduction of chemical warfare in World War I?
Well, I think for me, it's this relationship that I tried to talk about earlier. You think of it as kind of a triangle between sort of research science, like university science, and the government and the military. And I think that's something that World War I really brought about, is this relationship between big science, whether private or public, like university or big business, the government and the military. And ever since then, we've had to try to navigate that relationship, try to understand what are the effects of that relationship. So big business, trying to achieve profits, and the government trying to achieve some sort of success for the country, and the military trying to achieve victory. And World War I and chemical warfare are, I think, one of those moments where people realized, whoa, this is different from previous wars, that there's this relationship now that we have to pay attention to, we have to try to understand. And I think that another thing that's very interesting from the First World War and chemical warfare is the change in language. And I don't know if your research has uncovered this, but it's really disturbing how many people at the time were able to think of the language that we use for pests, like insects or rodents that humans have disliked for a long time for, say, eating their crops or making them sick. when you look at World War I and World War II, and the period in between, you see a lot of use of the language of pests and vermin to describe other people. In other words, if you're able to create an insecticide that can kill lots of roaches, then sometimes what people did back then is they would just use that same sort of language to talk about other human beings. And for me, as a historian, I think that's really important to pay attention to changes in language. And this happens during World War I and afterwards, that if you study the language of that period, you'll see how in the Soviet Union, the communists, the Soviets, would call their enemies vermin or pests. And you would see how in World War II, Americans who were very scared of the Japanese would call the Japanese vermin or pests. And it's this relationship between the use of technology, the use of chemicals to kill insects, and then that language migrating rather quickly over to talking about other human beings. So seeing your enemy as someone to exterminate. And this idea of using technology, especially chemical weapons, to exterminate an enemy is a really scary thing. And it happened really fast, that language shifted from describing creatures to describing other people. And I really think that this gets its start also with the chemical warfare in World War I.
And this is my last question. Do you think the generals cared about the lives of their soldiers? Because I've heard that the wind could blow back and then the chemicals could kill their own soldiers.
Yeah, the generals in World War I have generally, sorry about that play on words, have gotten a bad rap. They've gotten a bad reputation for wasting lives. And I think that in the final scheme of things, they deserve that reputation because it was such a wasteful war in terms of human life. But they really could not think of many other alternatives. And there weren't many generals who came up with good solutions otherwise. There were a few. General Monash from Australia had, I think, some really good ideas about sort of shock troops and tactical warfare, ways to reduce the casualties and still find effective methods. There were some Canadian generals who were, or leaders who were more innovative and successful. But I guess being a general is really hard because you have to put hundreds, thousands of people's lives at risk, and I think that for them chemical warfare was similar to the other things that those soldiers had to do, and they accepted the consequences that men would die. Now, what happened in World War I is that men on the front, soldiers increasingly thought what they were doing was a waste, and the morale really went down, and there were mutinies of soldiers, French soldiers in particular, as they just thought, this is ridiculous. You're making us go die for nothing. We're not going to achieve anything. We're not going to gain anything. And I think that those generals failed. And so I think you're right, Jack, to ask about this. Did they care? Well, yeah, they cared. But part of being a general is putting your men at risk in the hope that you can win. So I don't think that they thought of chemical warfare much differently than other methods. And I don't think at least initially, the Germans didn't really understand it, right? Those Germans who made that first attack at Ypres in 1915, they didn't think it would work, and they weren't even prepared to take advantage of it. So, they probably killed 2,000 men and didn't even know what to do, and they weren't even prepared really to advance much further because the men themselves were afraid of the gas blowing back at them as they advanced a little bit farther.
how did it impact the civilians, like in Belgium and France?
I think, again, this is more psychological than literal. There aren't a lot of people near the front. Once the front settles down and it doesn't move much, there aren't a lot of people nearby. I'll be honest, I don't know much about civilian impact, but my guess is that it's much more psychological than literal, that citizens are affected. Just sort of terrified by what you hear about it and learn about it secondhand and third hand. I think those nurses who had to deal with the men who had those horrific injuries would have experienced that sort of psychological damage and had to cope with really horrific conditions. I really honestly don't know much about the effect for civilians. I think that for the most part, after the gases dissipated, there were some that would stay. I mean, I think that the phosgene could stay in the soil for longer and could have longer-term effects. But for the most part, a gas attack was a relatively temporary sort of thing. So I don't know. I mean, maybe you guys have done more work on that. But again, I think it's much more likely that it's the psychological effect and less so the sort of medical or physical.
Okay. Thanks. Okay, I think we had to send Trayvon back for some